the day, Professor Saumya Dey, Rishihood University, will discuss his book, Being Hindu, A Political History from Aditya Chola to Narendra Modi, with Nandini Sengupta, journalist and author.
Good evening, everybody. It's my absolute privilege today to talk to Professor Saumya Dey about his very interesting book, Being Hindu. Over the course of the next half hour or so, a little over half hour, we are going to talk about the emergence of Hindu political belief and trace it as far back as late classical India. Welcome to PLF.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And as I was saying, to begin with, can I be heard now? Yeah. So thank you very much, ma'am. And to begin with, let me express my gratitude to PLF 2025 for extending me this invitation and giving me the opportunity to discuss this book. So where do we begin, ma'am?
Yeah. So I actually raced through the book. Please do buy it if it is available. One point that immediately struck me when I started reading the book is, why did you start with, it says, a political history from Aditya Chola to Narendra Modi. Now my first question is obviously that Hindu kingship or kingship laced with or founded on Sanatana Dharma is very ancient in India.
Indeed,
I mean,
yes.
Why is it that you start with Aditya Chola and not, for example, one of my favorite monarchs, Samudragupta? You know, the Gupta dynasty,
Indeed.
or say the Satavahanas or the Rashtrakutas, whose big elephants are all over Ellora. Why did you choose Aditya Chola?
Well, as you very correctly point out, ma'am, the dharmic mode of kingship is, of course, very ancient, and you could trace it back to the Vedic period, perhaps. The Rajanya in this historical epoch performed, or rather acted, in a political mode which may be termed dharmic. But the point here is that of self-reflexivity. This is a notion that we use sometimes or resort to sometimes in the social sciences, in the humanities. And what we mean by this is a kind of critical self-awareness. So, as I said, indeed, the dharmic mode of kingship is very, very ancient, but perhaps in its most archaic and most ancient form, it is not yet self-reflexive. It is not fully self-aware. It is not self-consciously formulated. So here we come to a historical epoch, which you refer to as late classical India, which professional historiographers, the Marxist ones, sometimes call early medieval India, wherein I think Hindu kingship is on the verge of becoming self-reflexive. It is being formulated in a self-conscious and self-critical manner. And in the immediately subsequent historical epoch, it is very self-conscious when you see the emergence, when you witness the emergence of an imperial polity like that of Vijayanagara.
I was just going to come to Vijayanagar. You've made a very interesting sort of, after the Chola dynasty, you sort of pick Vijayanagar, you pick also the Marathas.
Indeed, yeah.
Both of which are very consciously rooted.
Yeah, these are very conscious Hindu polities.
Yeah, in Sanatan, traditions. I want to ask you, because you also, before you delve into the medieval era Hindu kingdoms, two questions here. Firstly, while obviously Vijayanagar and Marathas are, very obviously Hindu and their imprint is very, very large, there were a lot of other Hindu kingdoms. I have written a book on Rani Durgavati. Rajgons, for instance, were very determinedly Hindu tribal kingdom. They are an example. There are many others in the heart of India who made sure that the Hindu imprint remained in polity. So, would you agree that their imprint was like a mosaic in which maybe Vijayanagar or the Marathas left a larger imprint?
Yes, of course, I agree with you on this count quite completely. These polities are part of a greater pattern, and the pattern is that of the emergence of a self-conscious, self-reflexive Hindu polities. But then at the end of the day, as a professional historiographer, you have to decide on the scope of your book, because history, as in the past, as a field of human activity, is of course patently infinite. So you have to pick on certain points, certain aspects of the past, which you reflect on, which you document. because reflecting upon or documenting the entirety of the past is not feasible. You might end up writing an infinite never-ending book that way. So I chose three polities on account of their historical salience. Two of these are very major imperial polities, which unified more or less the entirety of peninsular India. And the third one is not yet an imperial polity when I document it and reflect upon it. The Maratha Swaraj is founded by Shivaji Maharaj, but it eventually becomes one, and it becomes the paramount power from which the British seize India, the control of India.
Correct. So, a quick question here: do you think that the advent of Islamic invaders, sometime around the 8th century, is what puts this Hindu kingship in sharp profile?
Of course, yes, definitely. Because if Hindu kingship becomes very self-aware of what it is, the arrival of an exogenous belief system through the way of invasions, through the way of invading armies, it does play a role in that. Because as I mentioned in the book, the Vijayanagara rulers styled themselves as the Hindu Raya Suratrana. Now, there is this Japanese medievalist, Noboru Kuroshima, or Karashima, if I remember the surname correctly, who interprets this title, this kingly sobriquet, as Sultan among Hindu kings. And I believe this interpretation is incorrect, because Suratrana cannot be transliterated as Sultan among Hindu kings. It is someone who saves the deities, the savior of the deities. So here is an imperial overlord, an imperial Hindu king, who is styling himself as the savior of the deities. Who is he saving the deities from? Perhaps the adherents of a very different belief system, whom he identifies as the inveterate other, the hostile other.
So you also make a very important and very interesting point, might I add, about, Shaivism. And you say that because Shaivism was far more structured in what it included and what it did not, it enabled peninsular India to be able to withstand the Islamic conversion or intrusion of Islam into peninsular India. My question is, why then did it not act similarly against Christianity?
Well, ma'am, this is not quite my position, my own point of view. This is originally a position advanced by Nilakanta Shastri, who was a historian of ancient South India and medieval South India too. This is his position. I brought it up to kind of highlight it, that here is a point of view which is interesting. Now, his position derives from the observation that Shaivism is a very doctrinaire, and it lends itself to social mobilization on a large scale on account of its doctrinaire nature, that it formulates itself in the way of certain coherent, precise ideas, doctrines, which may be used, which may be deployed for social mobilization, large-scale social mobilization. But I believe the same point could be made about Shaktism and Vaishnavism as well. So just take it as a position advanced by a prominent historian, which I had to refer to as a not so prominent and not so significant historian. We refer to other people, our predecessors, the important ones. It's a part of a professional historiography. Right. And as about why it did not work against Christianity, you have to take note of the fact that it did not entirely, completely work against Islam either. Doctrinaire Shaivism did not, because Islam secured converts in South India, and so did the Christian missionaries. Now, as to how they succeeded, why they succeeded, I suppose it's due to a conjunction of factors. Islam resorted to a certain amount of coercion and intimidation. You cannot deny that, because it desecrated sacred sites, and since it was formulated or it expressed itself through state power, state authority, probably was another reason how or why it succeeded in securing converts. And as about the Christian missionaries, they formulated the creed as a kind of social salvation to certain downtrodden segments of Indian society.
Used coercion. In Goa, for instance.
They did, definitely they did. Even in this part of India, in Pondicherry, I hear of this temple which was demolished by the French because it represented
because
heathenism.
of his wife. His wife was
heathenism in their eyes. So Well, you have to see all of this as a kind of unfolding social history, wherein different ideas, different creeds are contending for supremacy and for greater social visibility. And the state is an important actor in this interplay, in this interaction, sometimes a violent interaction of various creeds and sacred points of view.
Your narrative talks about how the cultural moorings of Sanatan Dharma was very important to our freedom movement, and you've mentioned Lokmanya Tilak, for instance, and his use of Shivaji as a kind of a cultural slash Hindu totem around which people came together. And you've mentioned him, and you've mentioned several others as well. Swami Vivekananda you've mentioned. Is there any reason why you didn't include Sri Aurobindo and the Anushilan Samitis in this?
Well, ma'am, if you have sensed this in my book, the broad framework of it is actually in the way of a social activity. What I've tried to document is a broadly social activity and not initiatives undertaken by important actors. Because when you focus on heroism alone, the problem is that you typically end up focusing on the male actor, which is why when you read professional historiography or historiography of any kind, it is dominated by the documentation of the activities, initiatives of men. You don't find women therein. So I try to avoid that pitfall typically. So even when I discuss these imperial polities, the various imperial states which emerge, I try to undertake this excursus in the way of the documentation of social activity. I mention individual actors, well, male actors, only to the extent that I have to. So even when I move beyond this documentation and come to the colonial period, the 19th century, and I document what I call Hindu communitas, the emergence of an ideologically formulated notion of Hindu unity. I focus on large-scale social activity, largely. If you see, I try to document Hindu social reform, and then the Hindi Nagri agitation, cow protection agitation. And I mention individual actors only to the extent that I have to. So I make passing references, if you remember, to Rajaram Mohan Roy, to Swami Vivekananda, and eventually to Lokmanya Tilak. And I make these references because these people, according to me, are reflective of and they're articulating Hindu communitas as it is being formulated through social activity in the 19th century. But when you come to a personage such as Sri Aurobindo and an initiator such as the Anushilan Samiti, these are in the first half, in the early years, early decades of the 20th century, when Hindu communitas is already well formulated. So I give them a pass. That is the reason why I do not mention them. And as about the Anushilan Samiti initiative is that its objective was not to undertake large-scale social activity. Its objective was to, so to speak, incubate the heroic, virile Hindu male who shall take on the colonial administration. Its objective was not to undertake, as I said, large-scale social activity of any kind.
So one of the things I found most interesting in your book is how you connect several of the things that Prime Minister Modi has now taken up in his 2 terms and now in his 3rd term as well. Things like protection of cows, things like the Article 370, abrogation. All of these elements you show in your book go back to the early days of what you call Hindu communitas. I mean, to the time
I try
when...
to draw this connection.
Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, I suppose, Mr. Modi is a remarkable political phenomenon, and he has not been studied to the extent by professional political scientists or sociologists, for that matter, as he ought to be. He is deserving of being studied in far greater detail. Mine is you could say, amateur take on his prime ministership, because I'm not a political scientist by training, and I'm not a sociologist by training either. Neither I am a development economist, welfare economist. So yes, I do draw these connections, because his decision making and his initiatives as a prime minister are, in my opinion, could be, in my opinion, linked to the vision for India a broadly Hindu vision in terms of its cultural ethical content, which was formulated in the 19th century in the context of the emergence of, as I say, or what I call Hindu communitas. By the way, I've borrowed this term from an academic, from a historian called Sandri of Freytag, who in turn has borrowed it from a cultural anthropologist, whose name I forget now. It is not of my own formulation. Let me point this out.
Right. So also the way this Hindu political movement, if I may use that term, sort of developed in the early part of the 20th century. You know, when Deen Dayal Upadhyay and all the others the coalition of Hindu. Largely coalition of Hindu thought or cultural organization under the Hindu Mahasabha, which then became, the Jansangh and then whatever, and then finally metamorphosed into Bharatiya Janata Party. Do you see any very strong imprints that have remained unchanged? As this organization or this movement evolved?
Yes, I mean, in my opinion, one unmistakable aspect or characteristic of these political and social initiatives and organizations is that while they formulate their initiatives, social activity and their political vision in a very Hindu ethical framework, they're actually quite inclusive at the end of the day, Even the Hindu Mahasabha ended up being quite inclusive of non-Hindus, and so did the Janasangh and eventually the Bharatiya Janata Party too.
And the caste element, if you
Yeah,
can
that's right. They also bypass the traditional caste norms and try to uplift the traditionally or who were perceived to be the traditionally disadvantaged social segments, the caste groups. Yeah. So the thing about these expressions of Hindu communitas, these organizational and social activity-oriented expressions of Hindu communitas is that they are not hidebound. They are not orthodox in that way. They're actually, if I might say, progressive, but in a framework of conservatism. I personally, sometimes in my mind, sometimes during conversations in friend circles, use this expression, dynamic conservatism. I have not used this phrase in writing yet, but what I mean by dynamic conservatism is that you are forward-looking. You're even progressive in a way, but in a broad framework of your own cultural, ethical moorings. You do not abandon them, but in this broad framework, you also look forward and try to adjust your social organization as your own time and age might require.
So one question that obviously comes to mind at this point is you've mentioned, say, the role of the church, right? The Holy Roman Empire, and you've sort of mentioned that. When you mentioned that, and you mentioned the political role that it played, vis-a-vis the very strong cultural and very strong, almost DNA role that Sanatan Dharma plays, and the role that it placed in today's Hindu political movement. Can you talk a little bit about how they are different completely?
Yes, sir. So to take up the first thing that you mentioned, the excursus regarding or the discussion regarding the Holy Roman Empire in my book. I take it up because I formulate a certain idea in this book, and I originally formulated it in one of my previous books, Seedbed of Pakistan. The idea is that politics or political practice is always culturally formulated, that politics or political practice cannot be detached from cultural notions or culturally derived ideas. Now, to tell you what politics is, from the point of view of conventional academia, I at this moment remember two definitions thereof. One is provided by this sociologist, very famous sociologist, Max Weber, and he says in one of his writings that the state devolves a certain amount of power to all its citizens, and the citizens contend to partake of this power. And politics is the activity undertaken by the citizenry to partake of the power devolved by the state. Right. And there is another definition provided more recently by the political scientist V.R. Mehta. According to him, politics is the activity oriented towards or centered around the negotiation of conflicting interests in a social body. So broadly, we may say that the politics is the social activity which is about negotiating power relations and negotiating conflicting interests. But in my opinion, this activity cannot be undertaken without cultural norms, because this activity has to be moralized, and we derive our moral values from our cultural moorings, from cultural signifiers, from cultural imagineers, which is why, in my opinion, politics and political practice broadly cannot be divested from culture. So to flesh out this idea, I undertake this relatively long, not so long, but rather long discussion regarding the Holy Roman Empire. I try to point out, I try to portray it or illustrate the fact that it was a Christian realm. It was imagined by its rulers as a Christian realm. Yeah. So here is one instance of a very distinctly Christian kind of political practice. And then again, I also look at the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire to point out that here are instances of what I call Islamicate political practice. And then I move on to the Hindu imperial polities, which I discuss at some length in the book. And I try to demonstrate to the reader that, look, here are these instances of Hindu political practice.
Right. The caliphate also would be
indeed.
So the other question that obviously comes to mind when you talk about during colonial times, because both caste Hindus as well as Hindus of lower classes or lower castes all faced similar kind of repression under the colonial regime, it managed to break down some sort of caste silos. And that is, correct me if I'm wrong, that is one of the reasons why we see Hindu Reformation movements happening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Why is it, and this is a question that really puzzled me, in the Mughal era also, all Hindus faced the same repression. Yeah. Everybody had to pay jizya. Everybody had to, particularly if you were, say, unfortunate enough to work for Aurangzeb, everybody was looked at with suspicion, whether you're a Raja or you're a soldier. So how come the Hindu silos did not come down then?
Well, ma'am, what I try to argue implicitly in the book is that the colonial state was a very distinct kind of state as far as the history of the state in South Asia and the Indian subcontinent is concerned. You do very correctly point out that under Mughal administration too, Hindus were uniformly oppressed. From the cultural point of view, definitely, because the major sacred centers, sacred sites which...
Economically?
I'll come to that. As I was saying, the major sacred sites, the major shrine complexes which Hindus collectively revered were often desecrated and even demolished under Mughal administration. Yeah. But one also needs to, in my opinion, acknowledge the fact that at the end of the day, the Mughal state, the Mughal administration too, is a pre-industrial or what we may term broadly a pre-modern kind of state. And the pre-industrial, the pre-modern kind of state was actually a kind of a composite. I have recently concluded a rather lengthy book on Hindu kingship, wherein I make this argument. It's gone to press. It should be out in a few months, hopefully. That Hindu kingship was composite in the sense that it combined multiple political modes. Hindu kingship was simultaneously bureaucratic in the sense that the king enlisted and commanded a bureaucratic cohort. It was traditional in the sense that the Hindu kingship incorporated feudatories who were kinds of traditional authority in various corners of various parts of the imperial state or the kingdom. Hindu kingship was charismatic because the Hindu king at the end of the day was a moral, or had to act like a moral and spiritual exemplar. And it was also popular in a certain way because Hindu kingship incorporated at the local levels representative assemblies or representative bodies frequently in the towns and the villages. So this is a very composite kind of polity which countenanced forms of traditional authority. It enabled and upheld the traditional social organization. And Hindu traditional social organization has been termed a honeycomb structure, in the sense that it comprised these different jati entities, multiple social groups who had their own mores, conventions. Sometimes they maintained their own courts. They had their own caste-based representative bodies and all. And the Mughal state, to some extent, did the same as well.
Yeah.
This might be a very kind of unpopular opinion today. It was an oppressive state from the cultural point of view. It culturally disempowered Hindus, no doubt. But you must take note of the fact that it let the Rajput polities be, the Rajput kingdoms be, as long as they submitted to central authority.
I would disagree with that.
Outright annexation was avoided, typically, in this regard. This is all that I'm
But
trying
it was
to...
very centralized. I mean, the very point that you're making about Hindu kingship being much more decentralized, like a honeycomb, that structure was replaced under the Mughals.
Imperial
It was much more
formations,
centralized.
typically, ma'am, as a professional historiographers, what we notice is that imperial formations were, in the pre-modern, pre-industrial period, decentralized. The kind of centralization that we are used to today as citizens of the post-industrial state was not possible back in the day, due to the simple reason that the means and modes of communication were very underdeveloped. What I'm trying to say here is that the Rajput kingdoms typically were not outright annexed by the central Mughal authority, as long as they submitted to the throne in Delhi. So forms of traditional authority continued there. And caste level associations, sometimes caste level courts too, continue to exist at the local levels. So forms of traditional authority, traditional political conventions, legal conventions continue to exist under Mughal authority as well. But these were all by and by eradicated under colonial rule. Because for the first time in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, we have a centralized bureaucratic state which does not brook conflicting authorities under its jurisdiction, in its jurisdiction. So the traditional elites were displaced, and these were paternalistic elites frequently, who had kind of paternalistic varieties of paternalistic roles to play, discharge towards the social body in the way of sustaining it, nurturing it, or fostering it. So I'm simplifying or maybe even oversimplifying a lot of things here. So Indian society was shaken up in a way and kind of traumatized in a way that it wasn't before, and it brought together the elite and the non-elite segments in a way that they had not come together before. This is the point that I try to make. It's a different kind of governmentality, a Foucauldian concept, a Foucauldian term that I use.
I'm going to ask one more question, then throw it open to the audience. If we look at the entire Ram Janmabhoomi movement, do you think that as a Hindu political movement, it was a completely incipient movement? Is nothing like this happened in the roughly 100 odd years?
Definitely, this is the most spectacular demonstration of Hindu communities in the past several centuries, actually. And since the 19th century, definitely, when Hindu communitas comes to be consciously, self-reflexively formulated, this is the most spectacular instance of Hindutva as a social activity. Because I understand that Hindutva at multiple levels. So there's the purely intellectual level, which results in the formulation of Hindu communitas, the ideological formulation of Hindu unity. Then there's the level of political activity, political activism, and then there's the level of large-scale, broad-based social activity. And here is the most spectacular instance of the third variety, of the third manifestation of Hindu communities.
So I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Sir, your topic, your book title is Being Hindu. So my first question is very short. What as being Hindu you means? And like for me, Hindu means dharma, karma and moksha. Know the dharma, do the karma, and just work for the moksha. And sir, the second small question is why you started this political history from the Aditya Chola to Narendra Modi? Why it can't be before Aditya Chola from Pallava dynasty and also?
The second question he's already answered.
Yeah, I've answered that already. Maybe you came in a little late. Yeah. All right, so let me give a short and a long answer to the first question. There is this gentleman, Muhammad Mujib. He goes as M. Mujib, I suppose a sociologist, and there is a famous book written by him, Indian Muslims. The book begins with a curt, simple, straightforward question, which is, who are Indian Muslims? And the author gives a very simple, straightforward answer to this simple, straightforward, curt question. He writes, Indian Muslims are Indians who identify as Muslims. So to give a short and simple answer to begin with to your question, Hindus are people who call themselves Hindus and maybe abjure beef because that is one non-negotiable part of Hindu orthopraxis. Now, to give a long answer to your question, these people who self-identify as Hindus and abjure beef adhere to certain spiritual values and they express these spiritual values through a set of cultural practices. When you reflect back upon the past, when you retrospect, you find the prevalence, the existence of these spiritual values and these commensurate cultural practices in different epochs, in different historical junctures. So retrospectively, Hindus are the predecessors of the current lot of people self-identifying as Hindus who in various historical epochs at various junctures in the past adhered to these spiritual values and expressed these spiritual values through commensurate cultural practices. So I have no problem, identifying the Satavahana kings as Hindus, even though self-description Hindu did not exist when they ruled, because their spiritual values and their commensurate cultural practices more or less perfectly align with the spiritual values and cultural practices of us, the 21st century people who self-identify as Hindus. I hope you are understanding what I'm trying to say here, sir. So that's it.
Hi, thanks very much. I really enjoyed your book talk. I had one question. When you yourself admit that colonial modernity introduces a huge interruption from the pre-modern, the pre-colonial times, why would you put Narendra Modi, within that entire chronology that you're bringing in here? Because he's obviously operating within a modernist paradigm, a modern nation state paradigm, which is very distinct from a pre-colonial, pre-modern timeline.
I don't think Mr. Modi can be faulted for that reason. Because if you ask me what is the alternative to the bureaucratic state that we have today, and the state is a universal paradigm as far as the state is concerned, I don't know of an answer. If you could give me one. Yes, this is a paradigm of the state, a framework of the state which we have inherited from our colonial past. But he is also investing this paradigm with our own civilizational values and cultural ethos and outlook. So he is kind of indigenizing this paradigm as far as possible. We also need to acknowledge the fact that at the end of the day, all of us, middle class, upper middle class, university educated Indians seated in this room and our compatriots there outside in the streets are cultural hybrids. It's a fact. We cannot escape. So our social activity and the state is the ultimate expression of social activity, which Hegel understood in a way, is liable to be hybrid as well. We cannot escape this hybridity overnight. So if we are to decolonize, as we say, and break out of this hybridity, it cannot be done overnight. It has to be a generational process. What is important is that I suppose the process has begun in Mr. Modi's prime ministership. I suppose that is the most important thing. It will take time.
Can somebody give Anand the mic, please?
That was an absolutely magnificent
Thank you,
discussion. Sir. Thank you so much. Just one query, when you talked about who is a Hindu and you said Hindus are the ones who said they are Hindus traditionally.
And abjure beef.
And abjure beef. So on that point, was Swami Vivekananda wrong when he actually said that Hindus used to consume beef?
Yes, this is a notion bandied about frequently, and I suppose he partook in this notion as well. Now, this is a tricky question because I suppose a certain answer to it is difficult to formulate and give. Now, it is frequently claimed by Marxist historians that there is sufficient evidence in the Vedas that beef was consumed, that cows were slaughtered in yajnas and beef was consumed back then. But the problem with this claim being made by them is that they're all very ignorant of Sanskrit and definitely Vedic Sanskrit. Now, back in my student days, when I was an undergraduate, I remember this interpretation of the term Gogna, Vedic term Gogna, given by one Marxist historian, I think R.S. Sharma. And he interpreted it as one who feeds on the cow, or cow's flesh. Now, much later, when I was already teaching, I came upon another interpretation of the term, and it was as one who goes forth. So, Vedic Sanskrit is difficult, it's complex as it is. And when interpreted by complete ignoramuses, it is liable to yield cavalier. Okay, I suppose I thought someone raised a hand. Okay, it is likely to yield completely cavalier conclusions. Now, to go back to the point that I made a few moments ago, that we are all colonial hybrids. This element of hybridity, colonial hybridity, is there in Swami Vivekananda too. You cannot deny it. You must acknowledge the fact that in his youth, in his teenage years, he was a militant atheist and adhered to what was called back in the day the scientific temperament. And he was orientated towards Ramakrishna by one of his university professors, interestingly a British professor. So a lot of his mindset was actually derived from what we call today the corpus of colonial knowledge, and this would include the colonial interpretations of Indian sacred texts. So, yes, he did say, as far as I know, that ancient Indians might have consumed beef, but we also ought to acknowledge the fact that this is a notion derived from, as I said a few moments ago, the corpus of colonial knowledge and the colonial interpretations of Indian sacred traditions. And there's no certainty about this, as far as I'm concerned. I have read from end to end, cover to cover, one translation of the Rig Veda. Back in the day, a famous and much referred to translation by Wilson. I forgot the first name. A colonial era Sanskrit scholar. Now, as far as I recall, in his translation, there is no explicit mention of cows being slaughtered and cows' flesh being consumed. I remember one verse, as translated by Wilson, in which it is being said, the flames of Agni are consuming the offerings as a knife cuts the cow's flesh. So, this could be seen as a reference to cow slaughter. But at the same time, as I said, Vedic Sanskrit is complex and one requires years, in fact, literally decades of training in it to interpret it correctly. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is not a final. I mean, there's no certainty that Wilson interpreted the said verse correctly. Yes, there is another verse as translated by him or interpreted by him, in which it is being said that a knife is cutting something, some offering, like Agni cutting through or consuming cow's flesh. Only two references, by the way. Not as the Marxists say that there are ubiquitous references to cows being slaughtered and cow's flesh being consumed in the Vedas. So I suppose a long-winded answer, sir, but this is the best I can do.
Excuse me.
Just one.
Can I? Hello?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So my question is, do you think defining who is a Hindu will forever remain a challenge? Because if I'm not mistaken, even our constitution defines Hinduism by who is not a Hindu.
As far as I'm concerned, it is not a challenge. I've already given my definition. And, yes, as you point out, the Constitution is not clear about who is a Hindu, but then the Constitution also derives from what I just a few moments ago identified as a colonial knowledge. It is not purely an indigenous Indic document. It represents a colonial legality and to a great extent a colonial view of Indian society. It is not an Indian Indic view of ourselves.
Thank you so much, Professor Dey.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you to the audience.
Thank you.